Obviously not very well, I'm afraid, Khurram. We look with envy across the border because you chaps seem to be having a rather pleasant time of it in terms of being able to return to normality. We are still facing many places where the numbers are going up, so there's no sense yet of a peak having been reached. And in some parts, including both the capital, Delhi, where I am now, and my constituency of Thiruvananthapuram in the extreme south, the numbers are worse than they've ever been. So we are worried. Partly, of course, there is a feeling that the more you test, the more you will find. And therefore, as the testing has been ramped up considerably, we are identifying more and more people infected. And I don't know how many people or what percentage of the population you've been able to test in Pakistan. But this seems a virus where a significantly large number of people who get the infection don't show any symptoms. And therefore, no one bothers to test them. And as a result, we don't realize how many more have been infected. So it's possible that a lot of people in Pakistan may have had it or even may have it now and are just not being counted because they're asymptomatic. In India, because the reach of testing is...
The key here would actually be the fatality rates, right? Because you're right that there would be a large number of asymptomatic carriers here in Pakistan too. But just wondering why the fatality rates are not matching the infection.
Well, the fatality rates are... Sorry, finish.
Even in India, the fatality rates are seeing about less than half of what they are in the world average.
That's true.
Than here in Pakistan.
No, in fact, Khurram, I think you're right about that in the sense that throughout the subcontinent, including Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, it does look as if very, very few people, touch wood, are actually passing away because of this virus. But the problem is that the lethality of the virus seems to be completely random, in that people who are old and have comorbidities are surviving or getting very mild versions of the virus, and young, fit people are mysteriously passing away from COVID. So the problem is no one has fully understood yet exactly how this virus works and what it is in some people's bodies that makes them more receptive to the worst aspects of it or more responsive. And there have been talks about all of this cytokine storm and bradykinin storm and so on. There are various theories that the body generates, and sometimes a healthy body can overwhelm itself by generating this response to the virus. All of this is yet to be studied. I think anything that you and I can say today would really be in the realm of speculation. But broadly speaking, there have been some factors that many have talked about for the South Asian subcontinent. One is the fact that all of us take the BCG vaccine as kids. Actually, I was born in London, so I never got it, but my sisters and my sons, I mean, anybody born in India has had the BCG vaccine. And that apparently may have conferred a certain degree of immunity. And that all of us in South Asia are exposed to so many viruses, so many sources of infection, that our overall immunity levels are maybe higher than those of the mollycoddled West. And that theory is plausible because of one anecdote that I came across, that between Portugal and Spain, two neighboring countries in the Iberian Peninsula, the vast difference in their infection rates and their fatality rates can only be explained by the fact that in Portugal, they continue administering the BCG vaccine, whereas Spain, like other developed countries in Europe, gave it up 40 years ago, 30 odd years ago. So I don't know. These are all
there are other countries that are showing similar divergences. For example, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Now, both are on the same island, both have a border, and yet in Haiti, the fatalities are very low. In the Dominican Republic, they are well above the world average. We're trying to figure out maybe that makes for a good case study. But in any case, tell me about how are the political fortunes of the government in India being impacted by the rising numbers? I can tell you over here in Pakistan, the declining numbers, the government are recharging the government's political capital to a significant extent. And they are, they're running with the message that our measures have been effective in curbing the COVID threat, and to some extent they're even saying that we did it, we succeeded, we won against COVID. How is the government over there dealing?
Actually, it's paradoxical that the government in India is not doing well, and people realize they're not doing well in terms of managing COVID. But the polls suggest that it's not hurt them politically as it should. So we in the opposition do point out that, for example, the Congress leader Rahul Gandhi had mentioned as early as February that COVID had to be taken more serious, and the government was taking it, and that preventive measures had to be put in place immediately. Otherwise, we would face both a health disaster and an economic catastrophe if this were allowed to run unchecked. So he ought to be getting credit for having signaled this early on, much earlier than anyone else in India. Whereas the government was not only complacent, the following month they invited President Trump for a grand reception in Ahmedabad and brought him to Delhi and made a huge fuss about him with lots of crowds lining the streets. All of the stuff that you're not supposed to do if you want to prevent contagion. And yet, curiously, the polls show Mr. Modi still riding very high. So I would agree with you, there is a contrast between the way in which the COVID numbers have worked out in these two countries, yours and mine, but the fate of the leadership has not gone in the same contrasting way. Both seem to be doing rather well in the public eye, which to some of us in the opposition in India is still a bit of a mystery, but I don't want to discuss that outside India. We'll fight our battles at home.
Okay. Let me, in which case, zoom out a little bit. Let's zoom out in the conversation, talk about how COVID may have changed some of the trajectories that were already at play around the world before the arrival of the pandemic. And possibly the most important, and we can disagree on this, but we can say maybe one of the most important of the trajectories that was at play in our time, or that is at play in our time, is the rise and emergence of China as a great power on the world stage. This is not a trajectory that's a few years old, it's at least a few decades old, and probably has a few decades more to go before it reaches its what would you call it, moment of resolution or a clarity perhaps. But has COVID, in your view, how has it impacted this trajectory? Has it deflected China off its path towards emerging great power status? Has it somewhat delayed the process? I was surprised to see yesterday the Chinese were celebrating their victory against COVID, while in the United States on the very same day, the president was reeling from a series of disclosures from Bob Woodward that he may have known about the dangers of COVID and deliberately understated them. So we see two very contrasting pictures on the same day of two great powers, one celebrating its triumph against the virus, another one sort of grappling and wrestling with its political impact. How do you see this playing out?
You're so right, Khurram, because the fact is that there is a contrast. China actually itself had a very curious experience on all of this, because what they did, as you may remember at the beginning, was to be and feel extremely vulnerable. They were embarrassed in the first quarter of the year because they were being denounced around the world as a country that had incubated COVID and unleashed it on the world. There was open talk about decoupling from China. There was hostility to the way in which China had allegedly intimidated the WHO and prevented it from revealing how bad things were and so on. And China was actually in disgrace internationally for the first few months of the year. And they were actually trying to overcompensate through checkbook diplomacy. They were sending aid out, for example, when the virus hit Europe. The Chinese were rushing out in anxiety to demonstrate they were actually good guys. They were sending medicines and nurses and doctors to Italy and Spain and Serbia and so on. It was almost as if they felt they were in the doghouse and they needed to earn brownie points. That's all changed. In fact, it's changed quite dramatically, because what has happened is they seem to have turned around and said that why are we being apologetic and defensive? We've handled COVID effectively in our own country. We've actually, by our very strict measures in Wuhan, we've contained it. We have actually limited the amount of numbers, at least in terms of their publicly released numbers. We can strategically position ourselves as a guarantor of global public goods. And we can embark on what they now call wolf warrior diplomacy to assert ourselves in the world. And I think what's striking about that is that they've actually acted on it with a certain amount of vigor. And in fact, I would say even more than vigor. If you look at what's happened during the whole virus pandemic period in China's conduct, they've tightened their grip over Hong Kong, effectively ending Hong Kong's semi-autonomous status. They've increased tensions in their own backyard by mounting maritime patrols near the Japanese Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. They've sent vessels off the coasts of Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. They've redoubled their extensive claims based on their preposterous 9-dash line in the South China Sea. They've conducted aerial reconnaissance near Taiwan. They've unleashed trade sanctions and economic pressure on Australia, imposed 80% tariffs on Australian barley, all because Australia had the temerity to ask for an inquiry into the origins of the virus. They've even conducted cyber attacks against Australian government and business servers, and they've even sentenced an Australian man to death. They've deployed military force in their border dispute with Bhutan. They've cracked down on the Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. They've abruptly ended the so-called golden era of relations with the UK over that country's stance on Hong Kong. And they have essentially lashed out at India over the so-called line of actual control, where for the first time, remember, since 1976, no shot had been fired in anger, even on the disputed India-China border, because both sides had been able to keep things more or less on the back burner. Now you've had 20 Indian Jawans dying and an unknown number of Chinese, because they haven't revealed any numbers. And 2 days ago, India said that Chinese soldiers had fired shots for the first time in 46 years. So what's going on? I mean, it seems to me that we are seeing a much more assertive, India would say aggressive China, and that they're basically saying, listen, guys, the gloves are off. You do what you like. You insult us as a country that gave you coronavirus. We don't care. We're going to show that we are who we are. In fact, from an Indian point of view, it was amusing. We used to console ourselves with Deng Xiaoping's famous statement to Rajiv Gandhi in 1988 that don't, ever lose sight. He said that the 21st century will be India's and China's century. You can be sure that Xi Jinping will never say that, because his team and he himself clearly see the 21st century as China's century alone. And India is really a bit clear.